Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Donald Trump's threat of imposing 50% tariffs on India became a reality yesterday. And Peter Navarro, the White House Counselor for Trade, says the intention is to hit India where it hurts. So today we ask, is Trump being vindictive? What will be the cost to the Indian economy? And what can India do about this? Those are the three key issues I shall raise today with the Managing Director and Chief India Economist of JP Morgan Bank and a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, Sajjid Chinoy. Sajjid Chinoy, yesterday, Donald Trump's threat of 50% tariffs was implemented. He suspended trade talks till the tariff dispute is resolved, and he says he doesn't care if India's dead economy sinks. Meanwhile, Peter Navarro, the White House Counselor for Trade, says the intention is to hit India where it hurts. Do you see this as a vindictive policy, or is there some economic logic behind it?
Morning, Karan. I think the administration is speaking in many voices, so I think we should not focus on any one or two specific statements. Just a few days ago, Secretary of State Marco Rubio did talk about when announcing the new US ambassador to India, about the importance of the India-US relationship. We know just last night, Scott Bessent spoke about the fact that at the end of the day, he thinks, both countries will come together. So I would not focus on individual statements. I think we should not lose sight of the prize here, which is to continue with the negotiations and try and de-escalate the situation the same way that China did back in the month of April.
Now, Vice President Vance has said that 25% secondary tariffs have been imposed on India for importing Russian oil as aggressive economic leverage on Russia to stop the Ukraine war. Doesn't that suggest that India is collateral damage and President Trump really doesn't care what happens? It's Russia that he's interested in. India is just a tool and a means to get the Russians to do what he wants.
I'm surprised by that logic, Karan, because there are two issues. One is China buys much more oil than India does. Europe buys much more gas. And so there are many sources of funding that Russia has. So I think, it strikes me as strange that there'd be aggressive economic leverage against Russia if India alone were to diversify its oil purchases, even as China and Europe continue buying. Number two, I think we have to think through the broader economic implications of this. Frankly, from a narrow economic perspective, if India had to just diversify and buy oil in the open market, the macroeconomic cost would be quite limited. We have, the discount of Russian oil is now a few dollars a barrel. India could easily absorb that because our current account deficit is very benign. It's less than 1% of GDP. Inflation is very benign, running below 3%. But we have to think about what this means for the world economy. And I think that's the part that I'm sometimes surprised by, that the US administration will not at least publicly talk about. India imports 1.7 million barrels a day from Russia. If we were to move that to the open market, somebody has to increase supply commensurately. It's very unlikely that either OPEC or US shale has the capacity to ramp up to that size and scale so quickly. The implication, therefore, is if India were to move away from Russian oil, you're going to see global oil prices surge. And when global oil prices surge, it hurts everybody, including US consumers, and result in higher inflation in the US. So I'm surprised by the logic actually on both dimensions, both the aggressive economic leverage and why one would go down this path when the implication would be much higher crude prices.
The truth is that if India were to stop buying Russian oil and fall back on West Asian oil or even American oil, world oil prices, it's predicted, could cross $100 a barrel. And that would affect America and American consumers, and it would be very bad news for Trump. He, in a sense, is playing with something that could punch him back in the face.
Exactly. And that's the point I've been making for the last several months. But Karan, if you step back about what the US administration has been doing, a lot of these actions will have implications for the US itself, right? So it seems the US administration is out for certain purposes. They're following this very coercive, bilateral, extractive mercantilism in the hope that current account deficits and trade deficits in particular will narrow, in the hope of garnering tax revenues to pay for tax cuts. But remember, who's going to pay for this at the end of the day? US effective tariff rates today are close to 18%. These are the levels we saw in the 1930s. And ultimately, a lot of this is eventually going to be a tax on US consumers in the form of higher inflation. So we should not be surprised that a lot of the actions the US administration is putting out eventually are going to be counterproductive and self-defeating in some manner, which is why it's so worrying.
Let me, for a moment, go back to the point you made a little while ago about China. In an interview that he gave Bloomberg last night, Peter Navarro has referred to the Ukraine war as Modi's war. He says that the road to peace runs through New Delhi. But if the object is an aggressive economic leverage on Russia, how come China, which imports more oil than India, has not had secondary tariffs imposed upon it? In fact, in China's case, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, has said it's okay for China to keep importing Russian oil because that prevents inflation in global energy prices. Isn't that a case of double standards? One logic for China and a very different, if not opposite logic for India.
I think the one hallmark of the announcements and the actions over the last 6 months is there hasn't been consistency. There's been no one standard for anybody. The standard for every country has been different. We saw they started off with the US's neighbors, with Canada and Mexico, then went on to Europe. So I think for me, what's a little bit concerning is that the goalpost keeps changing. Right? That first it was the fact that Indian tariffs are very high and we had to bring those tariffs down. When we were in active negotiations with the US, then we were told it's Russian oil. So I think it'll be, from our perspective, important to find out what is it that the Americans want, and can some grand bargain be reached. I'll make one final point, Karan. There's sometimes an impression that China's gotten off the hook. Right? That's not the case. If you look carefully at what the effective tariff rates are, so, one just shouldn't look at the headline number of 40% or 50%, because a large fraction of goods are actually exempt. Semiconductors are exempt, electronic items are exempt, pharmaceuticals are exempt. When you do all the exemptions, China's effective tariff rate today in the US is 42%. It is the highest rate in the world. India's is the second highest at 34%. So despite this perception that while China has more leverage, yes, they may have leverage, but they're still facing the highest effective tariff rate in the world. That's why I'm saying to look for, a simple correlation about who these tariffs have been imposed to, what have their rates been, and look for simple reasons is not clear. That the administration is pursuing multiple objectives by weaponizing tariffs. And so for each country, the objective is different sometimes.
Absolutely. I take your point, but you're talking essentially, if I'm not wrong, about the reciprocal tariff element of the 50%. When it comes to the secondary sanction for buying Russian oil, India's been hit, China has been exempted.
Which is why I said, which is puzzling, right? So I don't see this as being aggressive economic leverage against Russia. If China can still buy Russian oil, and if the Europeans can still buy Russian gas, in that case, any impact from India diversifying away from Russia will be rather limited.
Now, against this background, the question arises, what should India do? There seem to be two broad choices. First, India could grit its teeth and hope for better times, which in a sense is what the Modi government is doing. Or it could impose its own tariffs on America and thus resist and fight back. Which would you advise?
Very much the first. I think there's very little to gain from escalating this conflict. We need to be firm, but we need to be calm and calculated and rational about this. We saw what happened when China put on tariffs. They quickly went up the escalation ladder, and both countries ended up in the month of April with tariffs around 150%. I think we've got nothing to gain from escalating this. Remember, there is a strong economic engagement across both countries. The focus and everybody's so much on goods and exports. The goods sector exports about 2.3% of GDP to the US. Think about services. India's service exports to the US are almost 3 times as much at 6% of GDP. The US is a large source of FDI into India. We have a large diaspora over there. The whole global capability center, the GCCs, have a lot of US firms. So I'm not sure that it's prudent, to throw a tantrum or escalate this and disengage us. I think what the government doing is right. To keep your head down, be firm, right? India should not negotiate anything which is not in our national interest, but keep talking, keep negotiating, right? And see if, I think the one part that gives me hope is we've seen with the US administration that they've been quite capricious, that, standards have changed with the same country over time. And so if we keep negotiating in good faith, hopefully at some point in time, a common ground can be achieved. Trade is all about win-win. There is a win to be had here. If US tariffs come down and India gets preferential trade access on labor-intensive exports, India stands to benefit. India is a growing market. We're almost $4 trillion, growing at, in nominal terms, 9 or 10% every year. If tariff barriers come down in the non-sensitive sectors, the US stands to gain. There is a deal to be had. The essence of trade is a win-win. So we have to put our head down, keep negotiating, and hope that at some point a win-win can be achieved.
I hear what you're saying, Sajjid Chinoy, that India has nothing to gain by escalating the conflict, but Scott Bessent, in an interview that he gave yesterday, is now saying they are encouraging the Europeans to impose secondary tariffs on India so that India stops buying Russian oil. And secondly, Howard Lutnick has spoken about how he's going to amend and change the H-1B visa process. Both of those would be very anti-Indian, and yet that's the sort of talk we're getting. So by not escalating the conflict, are we in fact allowing the Americans to go step by step further down the road?
I mean, there's a fine balance to be had here. Nobody is suggesting that we cave in. We need to be firm. We need to protect our strategic interests in the medium term. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Many threats have been made on many countries which have never fructified. So let's see what happens. I'm just saying that at this point in time, without any further action, for India to, impose reciprocal tariffs on the US will just make it more likely that these measures you spoke about will happen. So I think the prudent choice here is to still keep negotiating and keep the lines of communication open.
And of course, something that works in the favor of your argument is that India doesn't export anything to America that America can't do without. China exports rare earth minerals, metals, and magnets, which America desperately needs. That gives the Chinese leverage. We simply don't have that advantage.
When we think about leverage, one has to think in a more composite manner. You've spoken about goods and trade in particular, but there are so many dimensions on which countries cooperate, whether it's defense, it's military, it's the Quad, right? So I think leverage can be defined more broadly. Also, this is not to say that the US is not invested in India. When we speak about these global capability centers, these are large US multinational companies, right, that are, obviously benefiting from setting up very large centers in India that save them costs. So for a US administration that is seen to be business friendly, these facets will not be lost on it. Again, generic pharmaceuticals. This is not something that is tariffed at the moment, but something that I think few in the world can compete with India on that front. So there are instruments that we have, and so I continue to believe that it's in nobody's interest to economically disengage between these two countries.
Let's then come to a second issue. What do you believe will be the impact on the Indian economy of America's 50% tariffs? First, tell me which of the exports that you believe will suffer the most?
So I think it's important to put the numbers in perspective. I think the starting point is there's about 2.3% of GDP that India exports to the US. Now, about a quarter of that, about 0.6% of that is exempt because of electronics and pharmaceuticals. That leaves about 1.7% of GDP. Now, what has to look at is what is the value add in India, because there are some exports which have a large import content. So if they stop, the domestic value add is not that great. If you go through that exercise carefully, there's about 1.1% of GDP of domestic value add that is exposed to the US. Now, I think the part that's slightly concerning, as you alluded to, is that, these sectors are typically labor intensive. There's textile and clothing, there's gems and jewelry, there's leather, there's footwear, there are marine products, agricultural products. And so in many of these cases, gems and jewelry, for instance, even though the domestic value add is low, import content is very high, it's about 85%, they're very labor intensive sectors. So I think those are the sectors that we need to focus on and protect. Now, what I would recommend, and I'm sure the government will be thinking of this, is we have a playbook from the pandemic, because I think what you're seeing is the risk of an immediate demand shock. Indian tariffs on these sectors are 50%. For the same sector, in our major competitors in Asia around the world have much lower tariffs. So there's a worry here that once the tariffs kick in for some length of time, that US would substitute away from India to other countries. So you could be looking at this sharp demand shock. Now, we have the experience of the pandemic where demand just ceased one fine day. And I think we should go back and use that playbook. Now, what does that mean? It means in the first few weeks and months, and hopefully this doesn't stretch out beyond that, we preserve the economic viability of these firms. We ensure that even though demand has gone down, these firms don't shut down. That would mean sector-specific packages. It would mean some fiscal support. It will mean some liquidity support to keep them going. It will mean some regulatory support. That's what, and regulatory forbearance. That's what happened in the pandemic. So I would expect that if this continues, that would be the first line of action, that you've got labor-intensive sectors and you want to make sure they're economically viable in the wake of a demand shock.
But will that not kick up the fiscal deficit, and pretty appreciably?
If these are sector-specific packages, not so. And, I think when the fiscal deficit is important, I mean, this is an urgent shock facing very labor-intensive sectors. And I think preserving the viability of these sectors, preserving employment, ensuring that the knock-on effect on consumption, is not that large, is well worth protecting. Now, I think we're very early in the fiscal year. The government has lots of fiscal degrees of freedom. Non-tax revenues have been higher. So those are things that can be worked out later in the fiscal year. We have until next March to worry about the fiscal deficit. The urgent need right now is if a particular sector is seeing a rapid demand shock, we should use the COVID playbook to preserve the economic viability in the belief that this is a temporary demand shock. So these firms have to be kept viable and alive, and hopefully at some point demand will return.
Let's focus for a moment, Sajjid Chinoy, on what will be the impact on India's 41 billion trade surplus with America. The Global Trade Research Initiative estimates that 66% of India's exports to the US will be hit with the 50% tariff. And their head, Ajay Srivastava, has calculated that India's exports to the US will fall from 86.5 billion in 24-25 to just under 50 billion in 25-26. By my calculation, that means the trade surplus will diminish from 41 billion by 37 billion to around 4-5 billion. Is that serious and worrying, or can we take it in our stride?
Well, first and foremost, at this point, we just don't know. So I agree with the fact that 66% of India's exports is facing a 50% tariff, which is why I quoted earlier on the effective tariff rate in India, which is about 34%. It's also true that clearly exports will be hit and the trade surplus will come down. But to put magnitudes on day two, is at this point very hard. And I'll tell you why. We don't know if the rate is going to remain at 50% or eventually through negotiations, we can bring it back at 25%. That is a crucial bearing. At 25%, we're still slightly higher, but in the ballpark of our competitors, right? And so one can absorb that impact. At 50%, we're clearly uncompetitive and the impact will be larger. Now, having said that, a lot will depend on whether these exports are substitutable. If we're textiles and clothing and they're more homogeneous, the sense is that, other countries can gain market share. If it's other sectors where India's got some more specialized skill, gems and jewelry, for example, it's not clear whether they're substitutable. So at this point, yes, as I began by saying, there's 1.1% of GDP that's at risk. How much of that actually gets hurt will depend on how long the 50% stays in place, right? And what other mitigating factors India can undertake, and to what extent some of these sectors are easily substitutable.
Now, Dr. Rangarajan, the former governor of the Reserve Bank of India, in an article that he wrote for The Hindu, has estimated that this will reduce India's GDP growth by around 0.6%. A, do you agree with that ballpark figure? And B, if you do, how much of a concern is that figure?
Again, Karan, I don't mean to deflect the question, but it's very hard to assess this. And I'll tell you why again. Because in this case, there are even more variables to keep in mind. One, of course, is what we said. How long does the 50% stay in place? And what is the hit on exports? The question then is, if the hit on exports is meaningful, will there be an impact on employment? And will there be a knock-on effect on consumption? And that will depend on how quickly and how aggressively we can preserve the economic viability. And number three, there will be a response. There will be a fiscal response. There will be a monetary response which will buffer the impact on growth. So what the GDP impact is will depend on the interplay of all these three factors, right? How much of these exports get hit at 50% tariffs? Which of these enterprises are viable and can find other markets? We should talk about that at some point. The US, as large as it is only 15% of global imports. So India will have to aggressively look for other markets to preserve the viability of these enterprises. And then what will the fiscal and monetary response be to buffer the shock? The growth impact will only be the sum total of all these measures. What I will say is this, that the growth impact will rise over time because the first hit is to exports. Subsequent hit, could well be to employment and consumption. And if this stays on for a while, then you worry that it affects investment and animal spirits and China plus one implications. So it's not in our interest for this to drag on over time. And therefore, I said, if we can, of course, do the other mitigating factors we should talk about, but also keep negotiating with the US in the hope that this gets clawed back, is what I think is in our interest.
Let me pick up on some of the points you made. Exports to the US, such as shrimps, garments, textiles, apparel, can easily be substituted by other countries who have a tariff advantage over us, the Vietnams, the Bangladeshis, the Indonesias. But what about things like diamonds, things like jewelry? India has a specific expertise there. Can we retain that market? And secondly, before you answer, how easy will it be for us to find substitute markets for what we no longer can sell to America?
These are difficult questions and they're going to depend sector by sector, entrepreneur by entrepreneur. So there are, there are certain sectors which India clearly is quite specialized at, right? But this is still a large tariff differential between India and our competitors. So it will depend on whether others can step in. But B, there is also the fact that even if India were to export gems and jewelry, if the tariff is 50% higher in the US and the US consumer sees a much higher price, that itself will induce them to cut back on demand, which will then affect exports. So there's what economists call both the income effect and the substitution effect. The income effect is how much of these tariffs get passed on to the consumer who sees higher prices and cuts back on demand. right, for domestic substitutes. And the substitution effect is when you have these tariff differentials and people move demand. Now, in terms of, other markets, India has made a good start by signing an India-UK deal. I think we need to aggressively go down that route. It's good to hear that the trade negotiations with the euro area are proceeding well and rapidly. And I think we need to try and reach agreement over there. And we also need to look east and look at other trading arrangements. The fact is, we've got CPTPP, which is a conglomeration of about 12 countries. So India will have to consider other mega regional agreements as well. The fact is, unfortunately, the old system under the WTO, which is the rules-based multilateral trading system, is under grave threat. So India will have to find other regional trade agreements to diversify its export base apart from the US. As I said, the US is a very important trading partner, but the US only consumes 15% of global imports. There's a large fraction outside the US, and those markets we would need to tap into. The problem is these things don't happen overnight. They take time, and so policy has to provide a bridge for enterprises and sectors to be viable till they themselves can find other markets.
I'll come to the bridge in a moment's time, but you first brought up the possibility, or rather the need, for India to expand its trade relationships. We are negotiating with the EU. Newspaper reports suggest that we're expediting that, and we hope we can complete it in the next few months. But when it comes to international multilateral trade agreements like RCEP or CPTPP, the government is very reluctant to join them. And there's a danger in the case of CPTPP that if we don't join fast, China may join and may get some sort of veto over our terms of entry. But the government still seems reluctant to go down that road.
But I think in the last few months, we've seen a new approach to trade. And I think the events under the Trump administration are inducing other countries to look for the other markets. So I think the circumstances today are very different from what they were 3 years ago or 5 years ago. And so my sense is I'm hopeful that with the UK trade deal concluded, with the Euro trade deal, hopefully will be concluded soon, that there's a new impetus to finding mega regional trade agreements. And I would argue the CPTPP is a good one for the reasons you mentioned. There is no China there right now. And there's a large number of important countries in that trading agreement, including in Asia. We'll have to look east, because if you project forward, Karan, over the next decade or 15 years, the growth dynamism is going to come from Asia, right? The West is going to slow, and it's Asia which is going to provide growth, demand, imports, and therefore India will need to get progressively more integrated into Asia. Now, of course, that also means we have to do reforms at home, which I think is the fourth prong. So I advocate a multi-pronged approach. The near-term support, fiscal, monetary, regulatory, to keep economic enterprises alive, keep talking and negotiating with the US, look to broaden trading relationships around the world. And the fourth is, productivity enhancing reforms. Very happy to know that we're down reforming the GST. We're going to simplify it, hopefully, and make it much more user-friendly. So the GST is a really good start, but we need to do more reforms like that, on the ease of doing business, cost of doing business. Then you become more confident. Once you boosted productivity, reduce the cost of doing business in joining these mega regional trade deals, because then you can compete on equal terms.
Now, 2 or 3 times, Sajjid Chinoy, you've talked about the need for fiscal and monetary measures to provide what you call the bridge, which hopefully will tide Indian exporters over the interim period. But many of those exporters are small MSMEs. Can they afford to take on extra credit?
No, but there were methods that were used in the pandemic where, for example, government guarantees were provided. So I think the one advantage of the pandemic, having just gone by 5 years ago, is there was a well-established playbook, and the government was able to ascertain in the first year which measures worked and which measures did not work, right? So I think we know what needs to be done, and I'm sure at the right time, the government will ensure that those measures, fiscal, monetary, regulatory, are rolled out. They don't need to be big measures. They need to be targeted support for the specific sectors where the US market's a very large market and economic viability is threatened.
My last question. Can we afford to lower tariffs on American agricultural produce like corn and soybean or American dairy produce? That could also help alleviate the reciprocal element of the tariffs. But can we afford to do that?
I'm not privy to the negotiations, Karan, so I don't know at what stage these negotiations had reached. In general, and I'm saying there are some sensitive sectors in India where we will need to protect, and if any protection is reduced, it only has to happen over many, many years when the sector is ready to face foreign competition. I mean, we should emphasize American agriculture is subsidized a lot as well. So if you are going to open some sectors, it needs to be on an equal footing. You don't want a situation where US agriculture is subsidized and there's no protection at all. Having said that, I think there are other areas in which if India's import tariffs, so the non-sensitive areas, if those tariffs come down, that is in India's interest in the long term, right? That if we bring tariffs down on non-sensitive sectors, it increases productivity. It'll result in more competition, which will drive more efficiency, result in more productivity, and make our firms more, future ready and global ready. Also, remember, tariffs are an important part of this export push. The foundational theorem of trade theory is an import tariff is equivalent to an export tax. So if we do want to join these mega regional trade agreements, over time, we'll have to calibrate import tariffs down as well. So I think, as I began by saying, it's in our interest for both countries to reduce tariffs and broaden trade. Of course, there'll be some certain sensitive sectors which India will need to be cognizant of, on which we should, remain firm and do what's in our best national interest.
My very last question. Are you an optimist? Do you share Scott Bessent's belief that eventually the two countries will get together again? Because that's what he said in that interview he gave yesterday.
I absolutely do. I'm looking at the trend line and not the wiggles around it. Look at the trend line over the last 20 years. There's been a progressive economic proximity between these two countries. There are lots of strategic economic, non-economic interests that these countries will, I think, benefit from going forward. We've seen this in exports of goods, exports of services, FDI, defense, technology, diaspora. So I think, I'm an optimist that at the end of the day, wiser counsel will prevail. And as I said, trade is all about win-win, and a win-win eventually, hopefully, can be carved out. If that takes a little time, we should undertake mitigating measures to build that bridge until we reach that better day.
Sajjid Chinoy, thank you very much for the time you've given me. Thank you very much for sharing your analysis with us. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you, Karan.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times. And if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.